keep the momentum going and invite Dr. Wesley Herche and his panel to discuss the social dimensions of energy access. Wes?
So this panel and a lot of what we're going to talk about today, it's going to fit right with the theme that John just announced, which is social dimensions of energy access, which means we're going to get social here and do a little more talking with you than talking at you. That said, what I want to do while my panel's getting mic'd up, and get ready because you're going to get out of your seats, I want everyone to stand up. It's been a long morning, I know. We had some interesting weather. So go ahead and stretch out, arms overhead a little bit. Put your hand on your chin. Think about that interesting question you're going to ask. Maybe hands on the hips. Twist a little bit if you have to. Shake out your feet if you need to. Okay, great. You can take your seats if you'd like. So I say that because with this panel, I've asked each one of the panel members to give a rather short set of opening comments, maybe 5 to 6 minutes, and I want to leave a lot of time for audience Q&A and actual discussion. I'll talk a bit about how we frame this panel and sort of the thinking behind that. And again, I think my panelists are still getting mic'd up, but when you do, just please join me on stage. So, of course, I'm a geographer. My undergrad degree was in geography. A lot of my PhD work was in geography. I used to work for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and now I work at Arizona State University. So I thought, of course, we're going to frame this in the context of geography. The way we're going to do that is, first is going to be Peter Fiekowsky. He's going to talk about this topic at a global scale. And Peter and I have had some interesting conversations, both yesterday and previously when he visited Arizona State University. And we talked about how difficult it can be to get people thinking at this scale. But that's a lot of what he's doing as the founder of the Foundation for Climate Restoration. And so he'll talk about some of the work he's doing in that space and some of the challenges. Next, I'm going to have, and she's sitting to my right here, Bidtah Becker. Bidtah is the Executive Director of Navajo Nation Division of Natural Resources. One of the things that Bidtah and I were talking about at the table beforehand is that, oh, thank you, sir. There are over 22 sovereign tribal nations within just my state, within Arizona. There are 537 within the United States. So we're going to go from that global scale to that national scale, but I want you to think of that national scale in a couple different contexts, both in nation states, but also in sovereign tribal nations, because I think there's a lot we can learn from there. And I'll speak for myself personally. When I think about this land and what we might be able to learn from geography and energy, I think, well, what about the people who have been on it for thousands of years, which is certainly a lot longer than when my ancestors have been here. And from there, from that scale, we're going to go, we have a dynamic duo couple, co-founders, which would be Elizabeth Monoian and Robert Ferry, who are the co-founders of the Land Art Generator Initiative. And this is getting, they have some fascinating projects that they'll tell you about in their opening comments, but this is getting down to the individual level. And in some ways it circles us back around too, because they do these projects all over the globe. But basically they're going and asking the question of what kind of future do you want to build when it comes to energy? And they have some fascinating experiences. We got to chat last night about what they've found in their work, and they're going to share some of those with you today. So now that my panel has joined me and we're all mic'd up, I think we're ready to go. I'm going to turn it over to Peter Fiekowsky. And just one thing, Peter, quickly, I won't come back up and reintroduce you. So when Peter finishes, then Bidtah, and then our couple. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Peter.
Thank you. As a physicist, this is my first geography meeting, and it's great to be with people who are very interested in ground truth. So I'm going to talk about the climate, about climate restoration, and we all want to give our children the same climate our grandparents had 100 years ago. It's a very audacious thought, and probably something that very few of you have heard before, unless you happen to talk to me at the reception. And we know that to do something ambitious requires having a what by when, a very specific outcome. And President Kennedy in 1961 talked about we're going to land a man on the moon and bring him back safely by the end of the decade. And by having that what by when, very specific, we actually did a lot of collaboration, a lot of creativity, and got the job done early using slide rules. It's just amazing now to think about that. Restoring the climate actually goes the same way. That it turns out that the measurable, the what by when, is by 2050 to get the atmosphere back to the way it was 100 years ago, which means getting the CO2 back below 300 parts per million. And again, this is probably something new for most of you, and You get to think about this. This is the future that we want to design. And the thing about this is that it's possible. We're progressing on it, and it's our job, in this place, to plan for that future, because we want to plan for the future we want, not the future we're fearing. I'm an MIT-educated physicist. I've got a software company in Silicon Valley, 27 patents, and for 35 years I've been a citizen advocate in Congress for poverty and climate issues, and more recently also at the UN and the Vatican. And I'm also the founder of the Foundation for Climate Restoration and the Healthy Climate Alliance. So we're asking, where will we be in the year 2050? And a better question is, where will humanity be? 2050 is really an issue not for us as individuals, because a lot of us my age may not be around at that point, or not very active anyway. What we want, in the area of climate, what the prediction, of course, is that we'll have a lot more disasters. Live in Silicon Valley. We're about 150 miles from the fires up in Northern California. And for 2 weeks now, the air quality has been very bad. Don't go outside. And we're 150 miles away. So this is not going to get better. That's the prediction. Now, what we want, of course, is to restore a safe and healthy climate. And we can do that. And again, I want to inspire you to start planning for what we want. And I'll tell you about how we can get there briefly, because this is a brief presentation. Now, I hear a lot of arguing about the climate. That, again, at the reception, people told me, well, we've got a president who has certain ideas and so on. Well, the issue about the climate is that it's not about what we want as individuals. It's about what humanity wants. And of course, for the future generations, we want them to survive. And our species and our culture, our civilization evolved with a certain climate, and that's the best to improve the chances of survival, and that's this 300 parts per million. Humans have lived at levels almost 300 parts per million in the past. We're now at 410. The likelihood of our surviving like this, for those of us who live in the fire zone, it looks a little skeptical. So we do have to get the carbon back down. So how do we do that? Where can we put that much carbon? Well, the important point is that where can we put that much carbon and sell it? Because if you've tracked politics, you probably guessed that we can't count on the government to invest a lot of money in restoring the climate. And you can maybe guess that where I'm going is we actually can sequester that carbon and sell it. So you can do it I'm going to tell you about how you do it on the land and how you do it in the ocean. How you do it with rocks, because rocks contain a lot of carbon, and how you do it with biocarbon, with photosynthesis. Surprisingly, when you do biocarbon, you want to do that in the ocean. Most of us know, again, those of us who are close to fires know that when we grow a lot of trees, it's beautiful, and we love it, and it makes us happy, but the trees often die. They often burn, and the CO2 goes back into the air. In the ocean, when you have biocarbon, when you have photosynthesis, the dead plants and animals, they sink, and they stay sequestered for thousands or millions of years. So on land, the solution is selling rocks. That globally, you may not know this, we use 7 tons of rock for every man, woman, and child every year. We actually buy that to build our roads and our buildings. And rocks like limestone, they're almost half CO2. And clams know how to make limestone out of CO2. A clamshell is limestone. And we have a company in Silicon Valley which has duplicated that chemistry and makes limestone aggregate for concrete out of CO2 and calcium from various sources. That limestone aggregate is being used right now in the San Francisco airport, in the Salesforce building, and they're building their first commercial plant opening early next year. So that's happening. We use so much of this that in 30 to 40 years, we could actually sequester all trillion tons of excess CO2 back into our built environment. That's one possible solution. Amazing. And the other one is in the ocean where we can do photosynthesis. Of course, we do photosynthesis on land, but it tends to be short-lived. The ocean the limit on photosynthesis, there's plenty of water, there's plenty of sun, but the nutrients, if you imagine the big wide ocean, where are nutrients going to come from? They either come as dust from the air, they settle from volcanoes or dust storms, or they come from upwelling, from where everything sank. And as the years have gone by, the 90% of the ocean is now essentially ocean desert. It's blue, it's beautiful blue, but blue is not green. There's no photosynthesis. And we can replenish the nutrients, which have been depleted in part because a lot of the large fish and whales, which used to bring nutrients from the depths, we've fished out well over 90% of those. And now the ocean surface is very warm, and so the natural upwelling, which used to bring nutrients from the depths, it can't happen anymore, because just like in a warm pond, the cold water can't get to the surface anymore. So we can do synthetic dust, which is primarily very fine ground iron ore, and we can also do synthetic upwelling. And when we do that, you get a green ocean in the places where you do it, and you restore fisheries. I'm sorry. And you can sell the fish, and you can actually pay for that. And again, in 10 to 50 years, you can sequester all of the excess CO2 in our atmosphere into the ocean. It would increase the biocarbon content of the ocean by maybe 1%. So it's not for the ocean, it's not a significant issue. And so the point is that we have the capability now to restore the climate. And now, as you've noticed, probably that you hadn't heard that until now, but as planners, as people looking at the year 2050, we want to be thinking about, okay, if we restore the climate and give our children and grandchildren the same environment that we grew up with, what's possible then? So what I want to leave you with is that we want to restore the climate. It's possible, it's achievable, and we've already started. These projects are underway. The first fishery project, we're actually getting initial funding for it in the next month and a half, and it'll be in Madagascar. Let's plot a course for restoring the climate by 2050.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Bidtah Becker, and as Wes, is it okay if I call you Wes? Mentioned, I am a member of the Navajo Nation, and I am the executive director for what's called the Division of Natural Resources. I am an attorney by training. It's okay if you boo. I'm not sensitive to that. I was trained at the University of New Mexico, and I did my undergraduate training at Georgetown University, so it's nice to see a fellow Hoya here. Well, let me jump into the slides if I know how to work these. Okay, so why am I here? I am here because the Navajo Nation sits on vast natural resources that are used for energy production. So if you can see the dark blue line, that's called the Colorado Plateau, home to some of the most beautiful areas of the United States, and also home to some of the most ancient cultures and ancient peoples who have inhabited what we call the mainland United States. The yellow line is the wind belt. You see a lighter blue line that shows a minerals belt. You should see a green line that's coal, and then we have oil and gas in the northern part of the Navajo Nation, and you can kind of see a white line that's the Navajo Nation. So here is a different view of the Navajo Nation. We like to compare ourselves in landmass to the size of West Virginia, and you can see that in the bottom left corner. You can see the blue, light blue is the Navajo Nation, and then the darker outline behind that is West Virginia. So about 17 million square acres. The map above that shows the nation is located in what we call the Four Corners area. So we have land in Utah, well, I like to say the states have land on the Navajo Nation, right? We were here, as was referenced earlier, prior to the creation of the United States, prior to Mexico, prior to Spain. And what my Pueblo brothers and sisters like to say is we survived the Spanish, who had a kingdom in this region for well over 300 years. We've survived the Mexicans, we'll survive the Americans. Because as you know, the Americans have not existed as a nation state as long as the Kingdom of Spain was in this region of the world. But I point that out because in the middle, kind of in the middle of the nation, you'll see a yellowish, grayish area. That's the Hopi Nation. So our nation surrounds the Hopi Nation. That's a completely separate group of indigenous peoples, speak a very different language than the Navajo people do, have different origin stories. And sorry, I meant to time myself, and I just remembered. I am a lawyer, so I can talk and talk and talk. So as I mentioned, we have oil and gas resources. So here's some pictures of oil and gas production on the Navajo Nation. The middle picture shows some lines, and you can see some of the development with the horses. You can see some homes near oil and gas production. That being said, if you're from Los Angeles, you know that you see these very same facilities right in the middle of Los Angeles. Let me back up a little bit. Give all of you numbers people some numbers to think about. There are approximately 570 oil and gas wells on the Navajo Nation. If you remember that first map, really all focused up in the northern part of the nation in the Utah area. And approximately 528 million barrels of oil have been produced on the nation. So just kind of a little tidbit, when you mentioned earlier that governments aren't concerned about annual reporting, our government is. And there are other governments in the Western United States that also earn their revenue off of oil and gas resources. New Mexico is another one. So when oil and gas goes up, the budget goes up. When it goes down, budget cuts incur. I wanted to point out uranium. It's interesting discussion this morning about nuclear development. You may or may not be aware that most of the uranium production in the United States is from the Navajo Nation area, on or near the Navajo Nation. 18.7 million tons, is it U308? Do I have a scientist? Is that how you say that? Of uranium were produced off of Navajo lands between 1942 and 1986. We have over 500 abandoned uranium mines on the nation. So today, we are addressing that issue of open tailing piles, the mines have been remediated to a certain level, but not to the level of the US EPA standards to ensure public health and safety. And about a third to a half of known uranium reserves in the US are in a belt in this part of the world. Okay, coal resources. So sort of fitting, I followed Peter, because this is a dynamic conversation and a challenging one. There are 2 coal-fired power plants on the Navajo Nation and 1 that borders the Navajo Nation. And the 2 that are on the nation are fed by what are called mine mouth coal plants, meaning these coal mines have 1 customer, and that is the power plant they serve. So in the upper right, that's called the San Juan Generating Station. That's not on the nation, but it borders the nation. And over 80% of the employees that work there are Navajo people. Then on the bottom, I'm trying to figure that, I think I said right and I meant left. Bottom left is Navajo Generating Station. This is called the 3rd largest coal-fired power plant in the country, the largest coal plant west of the Mississippi. And the smoke you see coming out of the top, that's actually not smoke, those are water vapors. This is why I'm here today, because the owners of that plant announced what we call a premature shutdown of that plant. We had expected that plant to remain open until arguably the year 2044, if not 2031. And we were told in 2016 to be ready for a premature shutdown, and then we were told it would be shut down in 2017. We negotiated an extension to ensure that that plant would stay open to December 2019. Why? Jobs and revenue. Jobs and revenue. About 1,000 high-quality jobs come from that power plant and the associated mine. And the vast majority of the employees are Navajo. There are a handful of Hopis. Highest paying, highest benefit private jobs on the Navajo Nation. Then we have a third power plant called the Four Corners Power Plant. Again, as the name suggests, it's in the Four Corners region, and that's served by a different Navajo coal mine. And the Navajo Nation actually bought that coal mine in 2013. I need to back up to Navajo Generating Station because the coal for that plant comes from both the Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe. The Hopi estimates that about 75% of their general funded budget comes from those coal royalties. All right, I need to speed it up. So here is a map showing solar resources. This is being developed. This map is developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. The darker red, the darker the color, the better the solar resources. Wind resources, the darker the blue, the better the wind resource. And I've been told that the single best wind resource in Arizona is on the Navajo Nation. All right, and then we talked about transmission this morning. You can't talk about energy without talking about transmission. So if you focus on those lines, and if you can see two lines coming from the Four Corners plant to in the Navajo Nation Navajo Generation Station plant. And you see where those lines go. Right? They don't end on the Navajo Nation. They begin and move into Las Vegas, California, Central Valley of Arizona, and New Mexico. All right, we'll talk about that a little bit later. We are looking at developing renewable energy zones. It's a little hard to see on the map, but our zones are centered around substations where the power can be put into the transmission system. All right, so why am I here? I'm here to talk about the social dimensions, because what I haven't told you is that the poverty numbers on the nation are pretty extreme, right? I understand the United States is at full employment capacity. We estimate that about 1 every 2 Navajo people living on the reservation is unemployed. About 1/3 of the people do not have running water, and about 1/3 do not have electricity. 1/3 of the people do not have electricity. And yet you saw the lines, you saw the power plants. That electricity all went to build Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Albuquerque. Now, why is that? That's, I think, a bigger question that I'm sure there's PhDs on, but I think is part of why I was asked to be here today. Let me just go another minute, Wes, and then I'll end it. The reason I wanted to show you this map is because it speaks to the social dimensions in a different way. The big rectangle in the middle is when the first part of our reservation was set aside, both by us and by the United States in 1868, 150 years ago this year, right? Then you can see how the Navajo Nation expanded over time. That map, just like the underground discussion we had before, that map underlies everything at the Navajo Nation. Legal agreements, financing, just everything. And it's those invisible lines that either support or prevent development on the nation for various factors. But what I need to end with is what Peter, when we got on, we had a pre-call to talk about today's conversation, and one of the things Peter mentioned was, we sometimes forget that there are people living there, right? Right, because if you took a geospatial picture of the Navajo Nation, you'd say nobody lives there. Well, people do live there, and every single inch of that land is valuable to somebody, either economically, spiritually, or otherwise. So these are our workers at the mines of the plants. The large picture, that group of Navajo people won an award from Salt River Project last year because their work was so outstanding. But we are a diverse community, like any human society. The drawing, it represents those folks who are not as supportive of the extractive industries as other people are. We are a matrilineal society, which is very different than mainstream society. It may be one of the reasons I never leave home. But you see women in leadership positions, not necessarily elected positions, but in very strong roles. Traditionally, women held all property in the family. You see a daughter and a woman. And then finally, you see our Navajo code talkers. I'm sure you're aware of these gentlemen. We are incredibly proud of these gentlemen who I used to always say, just helped protect the United States, but really, in reality, helped create a whole new world order that we still live in today. So with that, I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
A little long. There's always so much to say.
We'll begin by thanking one of our board members who's in the room, Mike Pascoletti. So we are a nonprofit that is rich with partnerships, rich with participation, and we're very fortunate to have a board of directors who's taking us into our next decade of programming and capacity, and thank you, Mike. What we're going to do is invite you to imagine our energy landscapes as places that are culturally responsive, beautiful, and aesthetic over the next 6 to 8 minutes.
We've heard a lot of talk this week about how, amidst all of the talk of the Paris Accord and the historic achievement, we're still not moving in the right direction. In 2017, we pumped out 1.4% more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than we did in 2016, and 2018 looks to be on track to beat 2017. So why are we going in the wrong direction than the direction that we know we need to go? Gary Dirks yesterday reminded us that we have the technology, and it's about the application of that technology and the application of imagination to how we can apply that technology. At the Land Art Generator Initiative, we see that, at least in part, our failure is that we don't recognize the importance of human culture to the realization of change, and that human action is very often not brought about by threats, but about imagining a new and better world. And what if we could shift the conversation about gloom and doom of climate catastrophe to a conversation about beauty and cultural transformation? And while science communication has enlightened us to the threats of climate and heat map projections and rising sea levels and mass extinctions and migrations, we have to remember that we have to give people something to run towards, not just run away from. And it's the humanities and the arts that make us unique and that remind us of the world that is worth saving for tomorrow. So we're working with cities, developers, and communities to self-determine what a post-carbon future looks like to them, and use these new technologies that we've been seeing. Every time we see one of these new technologies, we think, how can that be a medium for the creation of art and public expression? And how can it match a unique society and community's culture so that it's not all just flat blue solar panels and horizontal axis wind turbines? Although those are beautiful in their own way, it doesn't inspire the world when community solar is panels on the ground surrounded by a chain link fence, sometimes even with barbed wire around the top. So we seek to broaden public awareness by inspiring and educating the public about the potential for a sustainable future, and now we'll show you some examples of that.
We bring together interdisciplinary and collaborative teams of architects, landscape architects, artists, engineers, scientists, to reimagine energy landscapes. And we've done this through international design competitions. So we've now held 5 design competitions, each its own site typology. We have over 1,000 ideas sitting in a portfolio representing over 70 countries. So in 2010, we were in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. These were urban gateway sites that led to proposals such as the solar ecosystem that would power around 100 homes. Light sanctuary. In 2012, we were at reclaimed landfill site, Fresh Hills Park, many of you know. And we had proposals such as Fresh Hills that use wind technology. In 2014, we were at a brownfield site across from the Little Mermaid, and we saw submissions such as the solar hourglass to remind us that there is still time to avert the worst effects of climate change if we act together. It also powers 700 homes using solar thermal technology. Beyond the Wave uses a thin film technology. This is a power plant where you will want to take your family on the weekend. Energy Duct powers a neighborhood. And in 2016, we were in Santa Monica at yet another site typology. This was a coastal site. And it brought projects such as the pipe that generates 4.5 billion liters of drinking water with integrated solar. We just closed off Logie 2018. We were in Melbourne. This is a site that is a very hot topic in the city of Melbourne and the state of Victoria. It's gone through multiple master planning stages, some less successful, some more successful, and we came in and brought in proposals such as Light Up that would generate enough electricity for 900 homes and also incorporates a cultural center. We work in other programs. We love participatory design projects. We do solar murals. We work with people around the world, including coal miners, indigenous groups, and others. We love to work with young people. So who better to nurture in this conversation than the people who will be at the helm of designing these energy infrastructures in 20, 30 years. And we hold youth competitions as well. And create a wide range of STEAM programming, everything free and downloadable on our website, and we encourage all of the teachers in this room to please do so. We love that professors use our design brief for senior studio curriculum, so we have a wide range of participation from university students to professional firms. And we'll end there.
I'd just like to add really quickly, the last slide does show some of our information graphics. We didn't put too many maps up, but if you go to landartgenerator.org, you'll find a lot of those. It shows the extent of the land use requirements for a 100% renewable energy future. But we think that that's an opportunity to create landmarks and monuments for the next generation, the kind of places like the Hoover Dam that people visit today, which is a monument to the WPA infrastructure that we built 3 generations ago. And we see that with over $6 trillion of renewable energy infrastructure to be implemented, think about 1% for the arts on energy infrastructure. What an amazing and beautiful world we could create together. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, so thank you to my panel. Hopefully everyone in the audience has thought of questions because we do have some time for that. While you're thinking of those questions, and we have microphones up in the front, feel free to line up if you have something that some of the panelists sparked and you wanted to ask a question about this. I'll share a quick anecdote. I remember my first geography class as an undergrad. I already knew I wanted to be a geography major, and Dr. Lydia Bean taught that class, and it was a general studies class, so there was only like 3 geography majors in there of the 100 or so people who were in that class. And she said, look, most of you, this is the last geography class you'll ever have. She's like, I want you to remember one thing from this class, and that is geography is a synthesizing discipline. And so if you look on the stage, and I think some of the panelists brought this up too, we have physics, we have law, we have architecture, we have design, we have sustainability, and we're synthesizing that just on the stage, and I don't know any other discipline that can quite do that in that way. It's one of the reasons I love geography. So thanks for everyone that's here and came out. So far, I see no one. Oh, wait, we have some people lining up on the panel. So we'll jump right in. If it gets to be a little slow, I have a couple questions, but otherwise, I'd rather take questions from the audience. So go right ahead, sir. And as someone said in the previous panel, please do just state your name and your affiliation.
Okay, Dave Kerner with the Torrey Group. The question I have, since we're talking about social dimensions, is how do you shift a cultural paradigm? We currently have one of more, better, faster, more access to resources, more things, more opportunities to buy, have, and so on. Those all have energy implications. But if you have to deal with the implications of energy, then how do you deal with the changing the cultural mindset that has got us on our current track?
Yeah, and the way we're going to do this, any panelist wants to take that on, jump right in.
Well, It's a very complicated question, of course. And one aspect of it that we always hate to talk about is that we probably can't have an ever-growing population on our planet. I'm not going to say much more about that, but having small families is going to be a key part. But more addressing your specific question, what we discovered in working on climate restoration and moving it forward is you have to look at it from a social perspective. That an individual has only marginal interest in the work that we do. And by framing it, we frame climate restoration as everyone wants to give our children a safe and healthy climate. So by framing it as a social issue, that we're all one humanity, people then look at it that way. But trying to make people change focuses on the individual, and people don't want to change. So it's a matter of framing.
Fantastic.
I come from a little bit different perspective. I used to do water rights, and anybody from the West knows, you know, the saying is whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, right? And I remember going to a panel discussion where the utilities, and I'm looking at our utility friends, were talking about how they've had to raise water rates and yet get people to lower consumption. And you've seen that happening in municipalities throughout the West. Las Vegas is a leader in that, Albuquerque. So, you know, there's always that economic side of it. And I think economics, again, a little bit cross-disciplinary, can fold in with, you know, what is the greater good that we're achieving. But it is complicated. Energy is complicated, as I think you pointed out. So for our people, for those who don't have energy, they often find that they have to get energy for their medications, right? They need to keep them. So it's this right. So for those people who aren't necessarily living the faster life, they need energy for a different social construct.
One of the things that we've found inspires us is we often think about the developed world and the developing world, first world, third world. We like to see it as the high carbon world and the low carbon world, and there's a lot that low carbon world has to offer, but we can't, we have to think collectively about shifting from a culture of consumption to a culture of stewardship, and it's not going to be easy, and it's about engaging people outside of this room and bringing an awareness of how wonderful our world can be in one post-2050 after we've made the transition to a culture of stewardship and circular economies, and really bring that into popular culture because it's lacking today a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for your question. And for the questions we have, if all the panelists want to jump in and answer, that's fine. But we don't have to, so it's okay. Ma'am in the front.
Hi there. Thanks for being here. This question is directed toward Ms. Becker. I'm Molly Seltzer with Electric America and Princeton University, and I'm really interested in the transition, obviously. I was curious if there's any efforts or planning around the diversification of jobs and what the negotiations looked like when you were talking about the early shutdown of the coal plant.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, negotiating the extension of that power plant lease was one of the tools. We used that as a tool to talk about transitioning. So a tool that we got out of that negotiation lease is we have the right to 500 megawatts of transmission capacity along the generating station lines. So that goes into California, Las Vegas, and down into the valley. So that's a tool that helps bring, so we have that, assuming the plant does shut down, we have the right to use that transmission capacity for 30 years, and for the first 10 years, we only have to pay capital costs. We don't have to pay O&M. So I'm going into a lot of detail, again, for technical folks, but that is a tool that can help drive down the cost of, say, a renewable energy project. Challenge, as you in the industry know, renewable energy doesn't bring the jobs or royalty rates, right, that the coal-fired power plants do. So we do have the first tribally owned solar project in the country was started up by our utility called the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. It emits 30 megawatts of power. It has one permanent employee. Compare that to the coal-fired power plant, 2250 megawatts of power, 1,000 employees. So I'm taking a long way of saying that the diversification it's so much different than what we have experienced. So I always describe the Navajo Nation as really being in post-World War II year still. Uranium, code talkers, those power plants were about big growth, right? Big post-war growth. And they provided a silver bullet in terms of jobs and revenue. The future, I think it was an economic director from West Virginia said it's going to be 1,000 silver BBs, not one silver bullet. The other challenge for the nation is we're 140 miles from rail or highway. So the short answer is we are talking about all of this. It's challenging in a consumerist society. One of the areas where we've seen incredible growth is in visitation to what are called our slot canyons, and it's coming from the Chinese middle class, and it's only happened in the last couple of years. So this world is ever changing in how we stay up with it in a way that allows our people to live and thrive on the Navajo Nation. It's a challenge, but I think it's one we're up to. And we're not supposed to be here, as I think most of you know, right? And all you geographers know that, and we're still here, and we'll figure it out. And I think what's different today is we'll figure it out together, which is what I think is different than the past, if that makes sense.
I'll add one thing too. I think that encapsulates a lot of why I'm glad we could put this panel together. Because on the surface, like when I moved to Arizona, like many people, you look at Navajo Generating Station, you say, oh, it's dirty and uneconomical. Sure, shut that down, get rid of it. That seems like the smart move. Then you start digging into that and you're like, whoa, that's a way more complicated issue than you realize. There's so many layers to this and they're all social. And thinking through that. So thank you for your question.
And just one tidbit on that. It's a huge issue for northeastern Arizona. Even our friends at the EPA, when they heard this, emailed us, like, oh my goodness, we're so sorry to hear about this. I mean, these are environmental protection folks. So it's complicated.
Thank you. Sir, over here.
Okay, I am still Jack Eichenbaum, and I still teach geography of New York City, but there's something I should add that in terms of my question, is that I'm 75 years old. And I have seen a lot of change in my life. And one of the topics that has not been covered in this wonderful conference is energy conservation. And in my lifetime, I have seen people waste energy in so many ways. When I'm a kid, if you wanted a Coke, you went to the drugstore and you got a nickel Coke in a glass. You got a cup of coffee in a ceramic cup. And now you see everybody walking around with plastic and paper cups. That's all energy that's wasted. They have to walk around with their drink. The most amazing one is nobody went to the gym when I was a kid. I mean, I suppose some people did. I didn't know anybody who went to a gym. Now people will drive to a gym and walk the treadmill for a half an hour. Unbelievable. And this is going on and on and on. We use machines to keep ourselves fit instead of using our physical energy. Outside of my apartment building, I live in a block with 2 apartment buildings. One of them, the superintendent rakes up the leaves. In mine, the super uses a leaf blower, and it's so noisy, and he's not getting the exercise that you get when you rake up the leaves. This was the only part of the conference where I saw the word social, and I've heard some of you mention the word culture. And so I don't know if my question really belongs here, but I didn't see any other place in this conference where my question belongs. What about energy conservation? What about changing our lifestyles so we don't waste so much energy?
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
That gets to the heart of what we're talking about, the culture of consumption, the culture of stewardship, and I would say that the low carbon world and the high carbon world is not just X, Y, geospatially, it's also the T. We've gone over time in every place to a high carbon world, and you're absolutely right. It's about culture, and it's about seeing how our life can be just as satisfying and fulfilling as we use less energy. One of the information graphics that we we did just earlier this year is the surface area of solar required to power Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and the cloud computing that has been talked about today and digitalizing everything does come again with a cost, and a lot of the energy conservation measures that we've put in place over the past few decades have been completely offset by the computing requirements that we've added to our culture. And you know, not making a value judgment on that, just saying that it's something that we really do need to address.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit, being a little bit controversial. I'm sitting here, you're talking about wasting energy, and I'm seeing the sun beaming in, and there's no solar panels here. And I'm thinking, well, gee, that's a lot of energy being wasted. There's a certain irony to the world that we live in, that we're using 1/1000th of 1% of the energy available to us. And the question I invite you to look at is, who are we doing it for? That if we're looking at ourselves as individuals, we want what we want, which is mostly cultural. And here in New York City, I just love that it's about humanity, that we're building media, we're building art that's for all of humanity. And when you look at all of humanity, then you look at it a different way. The only way, as I said a minute ago, the only way we could access restoring the climate, which is the first time that that conversation had been introduced into the United Nations, into the US Congress, was when we realized that the customer for the climate is humanity, not individuals.
Actually, just reminded me of another thing that changed. The elementary school that I went to, and this is beginning in 1948, was a school built in the 20s, and it had big, wide windows. And I can even remember, we never turned the lights on, particularly. And I remember the teacher saying one day, oh, I think there's a storm coming, we're gonna turn on the lights. Then I go to a junior high school, which was built in the 50s. I was the second class in that junior high school. And they had low ceilings and fluorescent lights. And the fluorescent lights were on all the time. So, I mean, there have been such changes in our society with regard to using natural light, and just wasting energy all over the place. It upsets me. So, thank you both for your...
I just want to say that I feel optimistic. And in Chris's presentation yesterday, she talked about the high school that we all need to be looking at, or maybe it was an elementary school because it was covered in solar panels, and that was driven by students. And I do think that young people are more tuned in than we were, and maybe a lot of the people in this room. They are being taught about conservation, and they are aware, and they are drivers of change. And it's our job to make sure that we nurture that and listen to what they're saying and cheer them on, because that's who's at the helm very, very soon. So I'm optimistic.
I think what I would add is, I made a slight reference to we're doing this together. So yesterday when I was flying in on the snowstorm, the young steward said on Southwest, we recycle. There's only one planet after all. And I thought, oh my goodness, I would never have heard that 20 years ago. But one of the things that my colleagues at ASU keep saying to me is, we need to get traditional thought out there, indigenous thought out there more, because and being a little controversial, there's some people who wear them, we're gonna occupy Mars, or Occupy Mars t-shirts, right? I always joke back home, like, there are some Navajos who support that, but the culture is, no, we're not gonna occupy Mars. This is our planet, and we are going to save it. So what I'm saying is, I think we have the answers. It's just, sometimes we have to look to the past, to look to the future, and we're now part of that conversation in a way that we weren't even 50 years ago, right? So I think there is social change happening, but it's not going to be easy, right? It's going to be bumpy, so.
Awesome. Thank you for your questions and comments, sir. Sir, in the front.
Hi, I'm Drew Newman. I teach environmental science at Morristown Friends School. And a number of you have mentioned the new world of 2050 that we're trying to hopefully optimistically produce. How can we engage the stakeholders, the major stakeholders, the young people that are going to be occupying and living in that world? How should we be teaching them? How should we be engaging them in these complex integrative technologies? What should we as educators be doing differently?
I'm going to add to that too, because sir, your question was actually close to one of the canned ones I had, is what should we be doing differently in terms of teaching? And also, if you have things that you've learned, and given that all of you are boots on the ground doing this work and working with the people, so make it two-pronged, yeah. Please, anyone wants to?
Well, again, our whole operation is about designing to get to 2050, so your question is perfect. And it's very much like what Kennedy did in 1961. You draw a picture, a vivid picture of the future you want. And when especially when the youth, and I was 6 in 1961, I was very impressed by that. I went on to do physics at MIT. The opportunity is to create for our youth the future they really want. You know, the not so overcrowded cities, the people having adventures. And again, I love geography because it's all really about adventure, discovering parts of the world that get us excited to live the next day. So give them that vision and then let them discover for themselves how to implement it.
Project-based learning. There's a lot of projects that could happen, so learn while doing.
And I would take that and say community-based learning. I actually taught high school for a while in a community-based program. It's expensive and it's time-consuming, and you can't use textbooks, but boy, did my students learn. So, you know, we would take the problem and then say, okay, how do you do it in your community? Challenging, but it's a lot more work for you, but boy, do the students learn when they realize, you know what, it might be my uncle who might be making some of these decisions, right? Or you know, who are the people at the utility, or how does the water come to us? Things, community-based is very effective.
I think I'll just quickly talk about our art and energy camp, just in a nutshell, to provide more context. So that example was a 6-week program where we worked with young people aged 8 to 17. We took them on field trips, so they really got to understand the energy makeup of their region in Pennsylvania. Took them to a nuclear plant, we took them to a coal-fired plant. You know, they walked along 117-degree Fahrenheit catwalk and felt that. You know, that little 7-year-old really felt that. And then we gave them lessons in energy science and art outside of the gallery, energy democracy. Why are we doing this? Why is it important in your neighborhood? And they designed and built a solar sculpture that is still feeding into a community center in the neighborhood. And that was in 2015, and we're really proud to say that that project hasn't been tagged. It's standing, the neighborhood loves it, and not only were the kids involved, but the entire neighborhood came out. When those kids were on site, you know, playing with the solar panels and putting them into position, the neighborhood came out and were asking the kids, what are you doing? So it was this wonderful community experience that we didn't anticipate, but we know was a really positive result.
And it wasn't very large. I think it's 5.1 kW peak capacity. But what was interesting is that it's around the realm of the per capita electricity consumption. So if every person in their lifetime was involved in doing that, then we'd solve the problem.
So certainly you have your work cut out for you, but I'm pretty confident I speak for everyone in here that we appreciate that you're doing it. And thank you for your question. Oh, please, yeah.
That we've discovered, again, working with the UN and the IPCC on climate, and then envisioning something new, is it's really important to honor science. I'm a physicist, but science is about predicting the future. And then there's imagination and there's the art of actually creating what we want. And I was just thinking about 1961 and how exciting it was to imagine going to the moon. But I was also, 1961, we were doing duck and cover drills in Washington, D.C., and the predictable future was not what President Kennedy actually drew in our imagination. Please draw the future that we want, not the one that's predictable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your work. And ma'am, you'll get the last question.
Joanna Underwood, I'm on the board of Energy Vision in New York. What is the population of the Navajo Nation?
On reservation, it's about 175, total 325, 350, and I'll compare that 1,000, I'll compare that to the size of the population of Wyoming, which is about 525.
The question I was going to ask is, you talked about all of the resources that are being developed there. Have you looked at your organic waste as an energy resource, because it's a superb source of clean fuel and high-quality compost.
I'm sorry, organic.
It's food waste.
Oh, organic
It's
waste.
manures and all kinds of biological materials. When they break down, they all emit methane gas. And it's a real resource that's only beginning to be looked at as something that you can harness.
Yes, there are. So one of the things, and I apologize I couldn't be here yesterday because of the weather, but one of the things I haven't heard a lot about is economics. So we have looked at a lot of things. It's the economies of scales that challenge us on so many projects. That's our challenge with organic waste, and then location.
That's what we've been focused on, and if we can help you on the question of projects and economics, would be great.
Thank you for that question and that offer. I'm going to open it up to one last question, but I am going to ask the panelists to be succinct, but I would like to get a response from each of you. I know in the audience, this is actually on behalf of the audience, I know in the audience there's a lot of people, at least for myself, that work on the research side of things, that work on the data side of things, computational, the sciences, et cetera. What I find fascinating about this panel is, again, I mentioned this before, all of you have been doing work on the ground with the people. What is one thing, an anecdote or a takeaway or a notion, and it could be something you've already mentioned, that you would want to give to this audience to say, this is a piece that you often miss, that you don't see when you're not on the ground, when you don't have those boots on the ground? Is there anything that you've found in the course of your work that has really resonated with you? And we'll take your comments and close the session. Please, yeah.
I'll start. I would say that interdisciplinary process, if engineers were going to solve the problem, then we'd be there. But engineers need to work with architects and all types of local stakeholders. We need everyone working together. That's my experience. Interdisciplinary and collaborative is my takeaway.
We have to fight the tendency of apathy. One of the anecdotes from our art and energy camp that comes to mind is that one of the young participants remarked to us when we were having odd weather that summer. She said, "I heard that the planet is ending because of the climate." So it wasn't what can we do to make sure that the planet is protected. It was, I've resigned myself to this. I'm 10 years old and I know that the world is ending. So we have to stop reinforcing those negative messages, especially to young people, but really challenge them in a positive way.
Thank you. Any other comments from the panel before we close?
Well, I guess, on the ground, when we first asked the question about can we restore the climate by the year 2050, when I went to the scientists who know how to get carbon out of the atmosphere, every one of them, and I said, can you do 50 billion tons a year with the technologies that you know of? We got 8 answers who said, yes, we could do that. And every one of the 8 scientists we spoke to said, this is amazing. No one ever asked me before if I could save the planet. But since you ask and I know technology, yeah, we could. So on the ground, ask for what you want, not what you're afraid of.
I agree with everything that's been said, and I think I would just add that intergenerational dialogue, I think, is where we need to be today. Intergenerational dialogue. I think it's one of the reasons indigenous cultures continue, despite the fact that that wasn't what the colonial settlers were expecting.
So for everyone, please join me in thanking this panel.